Welcome to the Rebound with Coach Matt Doherty.
Don, it's great to have you on this show. The title of the show is From the Park to the Boardroom, Grit, Growth, and Giving Back with Don Berman. I'm trying to think of the number of years when I first saw you in the park, first met you. It had to be, for me, probably 1974-ish. So I was 12, and I'm 63 now. So that's a lot of years, man. That's a lot of years.
50 plus years, friendships created that lasted a long, long time.
Yeah. Paint a picture for us. What was it like growing up for you on Long Island and East Meadow, more specifically?
Well, I spent the first 15 years of my life in the Bronx. I grew up about 6 blocks from Yankee Stadium and moved to East Meadow when I was going into my senior year in high school.
Oh, gosh.
So it was an incredibly difficult start for me in East Meadow, one that led me directly to the park. Because when I got there, I was 16 years old. I had skipped a grade in New York City school system. I didn't drive. I was the youngest kid in my senior class, and I didn't know anybody. So what do? You go to the park to play hoops. And
wow, that's a big adjustment. Why the move? Obviously,
my dad worked in East Meadow. He owned a gas station on the corner of Merrick Avenue and Hempstead Turnpike, right across from what was then Eisenhower Park.
Oh my gosh. Oh gosh. Over near Borelli's?
Excuse me?
Over near Borelli's?
Yeah, right across the street from Borelli's. I spent a couple of horrible Christmases working at his gas station with my brother in freezing cold weather. And we were supposed to alternate cars because in those days you had somebody fill up. Well, guess who did 80% of them?
Yeah. Oh gosh, I love these stories. They're fabulous stories because they're really define and set the stage for who you are, who you become. You could either decide to live a certain life or otherwise. How did that motivate you to become a successful businessman?
Well, I would say that the park provided me an outlet to meet people, because when you're younger than everybody else in high school and you're the new kid on the block and it's senior year, it's like you're an outcast.
Mm-hmm.
So being at the park created for me not only an opportunity to be competitive and meet people, but also to remove the isolation. Yeah. I got very used to introducing myself to new people and trying to create relationships. And that is a skill that has really, I think, been transformative in terms of my own business success.
Wow. I love this stuff. So the park, just for the audience, and Don, the audience is basically entrepreneurs, founders, CEOs, people in business, leadership roles that want to aspire to grow. So the park is basically for us, was 3 blocks from my house. They had a big pool. It was all public pool, paddleball courts, 2 full basketball courts, tennis courts. And the park is where, from what I remember, the best players in Nassau County, we were from East Meadow, about 30 minutes from New York City on the South Shore, would come. High school, college, and pro. So what was like, how did you find out about the park and your first experience?
So I had played basketball in the city for my high school. I was on the team at Taft. When I came to East Meadow, the only thing I really knew how to do was play ball, other than hang out with the guys that I was friendly with in the Bronx. So for you, it was 3 blocks to the park. For me, it was probably half a mile. Mm-hmm. And what I would do generally is get in the car with my brother and we'd go up and shoot around and play one-on-one. So there's two great stories. The very first game that I played at Prospect Park was against Bob McKillop and Kevin Joyce. And
Look,
I
look.
came
Let me guess.
from the
Let me guess. They set you up to take your money by playing left-handed and wearing black socks and sucking you into a game. Is that true?
I don't think they knew me well enough yet to sucker me in. We just played 2-on-2. Obviously, it was very difficult to score on guys that held you and, used their bodies. I remember getting in the car with my brother, and we're from New York City. It was rough. I said, I've never played with a guy that was so dirty. He held every single time. It was great. And of course, as you know, to push this forward 50 something years, Bob is one of my closest and dearest friends.
Yeah. Now, for the audience, Bob McKillop, the famous head coach, and I think deserved to be a Hall of Famer, head coach at Davidson College, where he coached Steph Curry, and was my high school coach at Holy Trinity High School on Long Island in Hicksville. And then Kevin Joyce was the player. Kevin Joyce was one of the best players ever to set foot in a park. Kevin played at Malloy. He was from Merrick, I believe, was living in Merrick and played for the Indiana Pacers, the Kentucky Colonels, played at South Carolina, was an All-American, and was on the 1972 Olympic basketball team. So you're talking about two great players, because Bob was a really good player at Hofstra.
Matt, when you say that, there are high school All-Americans, including yourself, that played at Prospect Park, I can think of Tom Riker. You mentioned Brian Winters and Kevin Joyce, John Roche, Tom Owens, like the starting five from University of South Carolina that was ranked number 1 in the country in 1973 or 2, I forget the year. I mean, and then you had NBA players, ABA players. The competition in that park was unbelievable. I've never seen or heard of one place like the Rucker had players that came down, but they weren't there every Tuesday night and Thursday night in the summer and Saturday afternoon and Sunday. It was a battlefield.
OMJ Clothing is an elite men's clothing store that provides a vast array of spectacular brands of men's lifestyle apparel for every day. Elevate your business upscale casual at OMJ. Success comes from standing out. This is perfect. I want to write a book called The Park. I'm working on it, and this will go into it because these are the lessons that I want to share. What lessons did you learn on that court that still show up in your boardroom today?
Well, let me just take a little derivative of that question, because my success in business basically comes from the park. Because I will tell you unquestionably, 98% of the time, I was the least talented player on the court. And I'm not self-deprecating. That is a fact. And so how do you be successful if you're not the smartest guy in the boardroom or the best player on the court?
Right.
It's you have to outwork everybody else that surrounds you. Mm-hmm. And being successful in business has more to do with hard work and work ethic and showing up on time and being ready, being prepared, because you have to be the best you can be when everyone else around you, and this is the God's honest truth, is better than you. Mm-hmm. And in the boardroom, look, I'm intelligent, but I'm not super smart. And the people in my boardroom, the people on my executive team are smarter than me,
right? Except
for one thing. I recognize my strengths and weaknesses, and 95% of the people I interact with only know their strengths.
Right. So it's like picking next in the park, right? You're sitting, you have next up, and you're trying to put a team together that can win and stay on the court. Because if you lose, you sit, and someone, like you or me at that point might not get picked up, and you might be done for the night or have to go to court 2 and play against the second level players, right? So you got to put a team together of talented players that augment each other's skill set, just like you do putting a senior leadership team together for your company. Is that fair to say?
That is 100% right. That is 100% right. You have to pick the right players who have talent. You have to pick the players who want to stay on the court, and you have to pick players that complement each other.
Now, how in a short period of time do you create a chemistry on a court? Will team players will accept their role? Roles will be defined. There were no referees. You called your own fouls. How did that come together in such a short period of time?
I think it's just knowing personalities. Most of the people who played at the park on a regular basis, you got to know their games. You got to know who shared the ball, who didn't share the ball, who was going to rebound, who was going to play defense. And over time, you realize who's good at what.
Right.
And when you do that and you have next, you can generally handpick a team. But, thinking of things that I remember from the park, I remember on Tuesday and Thursday nights during the summers when everybody was home from college, some of the NBA players who weren't in the playoffs would come down, Joe Dupree, Jim O'Brien. And if you lost, not if you, well, you at that time, yes, because you were so young. You were so young. But a guy like me, I think I'm probably 10, 12 years older than you. If I didn't win, I would stick around to watch, but ain't nobody picking me.
Yeah. You had a choice. Like at that point when I was, in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, 9th grade, I'd either watch because like you said, there were so many great players and the competition was so intense, or I'd go to court 2 where I might be the better player on the court and continue to play. One last thing about playing. Point game, or let's put it this way, the last game of the night, and let's say your team ran the court. Let's say you won 4 or 5 in a row, and it was last game because the park closed at 10.
Right.
What went through your mind?
The last game, I rarely found myself on the court at that time. But when I did, it was, I have to win this game. I have to go home a winner.
Right. Even if you won 4 or 5 games in a row.
Last game, you got to win. There's nothing that follows that.
I'm getting goosebumps as you talk because I remember Bob and Paul Eibler and those guys would talk. You're only as good as your last game.
That's what people would remember.
And you have a bad taste in your mouth. So it's a personal pride because no one was really watching. It's a personal pride. And how did that help you in business? And do you, like a lot of people want to complain about millennials and Generation Zs, they don't have that work ethic. They don't show up. They don't care as much. What do you see in the younger generation, and how do you find that type of pride and care in a younger generation, or how do you develop it?
Those are great questions. I would agree with your assessment. It's people today, young kids, millennials, Z generation, are impatient. They're not willing to put in the work. They're short-sighted. They want to go to they want to play on the A court immediately.
Yeah, they do.
And how do you develop that? I mentor a bunch of young CEOs, And what I try to teach them is life is simple if you keep it simple. You make it complex, it really comes down to the things I said earlier. Hard work, work ethic, show up, give 100%. It's not easy to develop. Most young adults are very, very impatient.
Yeah. So when you get one, I mean, it's like the park. You want to get talent. You want to get it early. I bet, some people do a good job of getting internships, getting kids that are in college and developing them and trying them out, if you will, before it's time to hire them. But you can never have enough talent. And sometimes I, as an executive coach, always am talking about building the bench, building your bench. And do you have a player on your roster that can play multiple positions, right? Because what if, and I learned this as a coach, what if your best player gets hurt? What if your best player gets in foul trouble? What if the proverbial, your star player, your CFO gets hit by a bus? Who's the backup? Who can you go to and sub them in at a key moment? And maybe it's fractional. But if you have somebody on your team that you're developing and they can fill a gap like a utility infielder, that's pretty valuable position, I would think.
Very valuable. And I think one of the roles that your leadership team has to play for you is to make sure that they're developing. Because my CFO can't become the CEO if he doesn't have somebody that's ready to take his role.
That's
my
right.
president and chief operating officer, same thing. So a responsibility in leadership is not only to lead, but it's to develop the talent that you have. And Matt, you coached at the highest levels. Not everybody needs to be an A-plus player, because your bench players, you want them to think that they're A players, but they may not be. They're great role players.
Right.
Your point about utility infield. So that's what the CEO seat is supposed to do, is to orchestrate that.
And I love these interviews because I have a game plan. It's like a game, right? You have a scouting report, you have a game plan, and all of a sudden something happens in the game and you decide to go zone. How have you invested in your team in terms of leadership development?
I think the biggest investment that I make in leadership development is giving them time with me. There's all kinds of external courses you can take, you get an MBA, etc. But really, it's practice versus theory. I'm not a big theory guy. I'm not saying it's wrong, but really practical experience is what defines the success of an organization. Not reading a textbook, getting an org chart and saying this is how we should organize.
Right.
And so for me, I spend time with my 8 direct reports. I learn from them and they learn from me.
Time. I as an executive coach, I love it because I learn from the speakers we have. I'm a chair with a company called Vistage, and we have great speakers. We had somebody who was a fighter pilot in the Air Force, and leadership is a practice. We talked off air about you playing tennis and we playing basketball, and you had to practice. If you didn't practice, you're not going to get better. And we needed coaches to help us to find what we needed to work on and help us get reps in. And we had this great speaker, and he talked about the Eisenhower time matrix, which I think we've all seen in business. And it's the 4 quadrants, and quadrant 1 is urgent and important. Quadrant 2 is not urgent, but important. Quadrant 3 is urgent, not important. Quadrant 4, not important, not urgent. And a lot of us, me included, tend to live in quadrant 1. and that could lead to burnout, where it was explained in this exercise that leaders should live in quadrant 2, which is planning, relationship building, basically what you just described, spending time with your people, because the more time you spend in quadrant 2 of the Eisenhower time matrix, the less time you're putting out fires in quadrant 1. And how do you create that time and not work frantically, right? I mean, how do you plan your day, your week, your month? How did you get to that point where you could spend quality time with your team?
Because if you hire talented people to do certain specific jobs, the worst thing a CEO and leader can do is to meddle in their business. They're experts in technology, in finance. Their depth of knowledge far exceeds, with very few, certainly far exceeds mine, but it generally, with the exception of a Jamie Dimon, it far exceeds any CEO's ability to dig that deep.
Mm-hmm.
So let them do their job. And if you allow them to do that, they'll grow in their position, they'll make their mistakes, and they will know to come to you for the issues that they aren't clear on. And that's how you end up spending time, how I end up spending time with my directs. Yeah, we'll have scheduled meetings every 2 weeks, but I don't sit on top of people. I give them the freedom to make the mistakes. It's like Coach McKillop did with Steph Curry.
Right.
He's going to make mistakes. He'll learn from those mistakes. It's the best way to learn, as I'm sure as we both develop on the court and off the court, we've made tons of mistakes.
Right.
But we learn from them.
So as you founded CardWorks in 1987, is that correct, Don?
That is correct. That is correct.
That was kind of before fintech was a buzzword. What was your original vision for CardWorks?
My original vision had nothing to do with lending. Well, I shouldn't say that. We weren't going to be a lender. We were a platform to service other lenders. In order to be a lender, in today's world, you don't necessarily need a bank. But back in 1987 probably through 2000, if you didn't have a bank, you couldn't be a lender. Well, where was I going to get the money? A lower income kid from the Bronx who moved to a middle class in East Meadow, where was I going to get the money to own a bank? So we created a platform where banks could outsource all of their back office work. And the transitional period for CardWorks was 10 years in, 1997. We were approached by a private equity firm. And Matt, I think I'm relatively sophisticated today in finance. Back then, I couldn't spell private equity. And so we got approached. It was a private equity firm that wanted to be in the subprime lending business, and they needed a platform. And lo and behold, it changed the nature of our business from being a service provider to being a service provider and a lender.
Wow. How many people did you start with in 1987?
Three. Can I tell you a funny?
Yeah, sure, please.
So I signed my first client, a bank which, probably appropriately was headquartered in the Bronx, and they invested $250,000 in us. That was our first investment. The second client the second prospect was coming to visit our operation. They were bringing 5 people. I had 3. So I figured we better play 5 on 5. I got my wife and my mother to come to the office that day and sit at desks. Those are the humble beginnings at which joy was the word.
That is like something you learn in the park, right? The gamesmanship, the deception, the resourcefulness, what are we going to do? Man down. Bob would call it bogarting. That's classic. So 10 years later, private equity comes in. How many full-time employees do you have?
We probably had at that point, give or take 250.
Wow.
Maybe 300. Today we're up to 3,000.
Rapid growth. So a challenge a lot of entrepreneurs have, they dream of the growth that you've experienced, but going from 3 to 50 seems to be a magic number, right? They get to 50 and all of a sudden things change, relationships change. Maybe even before that, the delegation, moving up the org chart and having to work through a layer to get to another layer. What was the biggest challenge for you, or that you see with the CEOs that you're working with today as they delegate to elevate?
Most of the biggest challenge I see is that they're in such a hurry to get to that scale, oftentimes because they've taken VC money and VCs are pushing them to spend the money and grow. Patience, just like at the park, at the park.
The jumper.
Sometimes it was worth sitting on the sideline because you had not next, but the next.
Right.
So you have to have patience to get back on the court. Growing quickly it's wonderful, but 95% of the companies that I've seen, they can't handle the growth.
Yep.
And if you're not servicing your customers, you're not going to stay in business.
Yeah.
And one statement that I always made was never let our growth outstrip our infrastructure's ability to support the client.
Yeah. So I used this in the last show. It's obviously a rough drawing. I call it the organizational triangle, where at the top you have talent, and then you have systems, and you have culture. And the better, the systems, the better the culture, the better your talent is supported. And systems and culture are attached at the hip, but they're a little different in my estimation. A lot of businesses, especially entrepreneurial businesses nowadays, use a system. Some use something called EOS, the Entrepreneur's Operating System. What kind of system did you have in place? Like, Dean Smith, I was blessed to play for. He had a system, offense and defensive systems. What systems or structures did you put in place to support the growth, the dynamic growth that you had at CardWorks?
I think that we defined systems through the people that we had. The culture at CardWorks from day one, more important than talent, more important than strategy, is culture.
That's right. 100%.
And we don't just say we are a people-centric company. We walk that walk, talk that talk. And so people were always the most important part of our organization. And with that filtering through to at that point, the few people, I didn't have 8 direct reports.
Right.
I had 2 people that I worked really closely with, and then the rest of the organization was my direct report. If somebody wanted to come and talk to Don Berman, they knew where my office was. The door was wide open. And it was that ability to say to people, we care about you, and execute on that fact that allowed us to handle the growth. Because I can't even remember what salaries were like back then, but we did everything for our people. And in return, they gave us everything we asked.
The culture, say culture's king. It's more important than systems, more important than good talent, Because if you could have, we've seen it, you could have great talent, great systems, but if your culture stinks, you're not going to be successful.
That is,
On the flip side, you could have average talent and average systems, but a great culture, and you could win a lot of games. Your culture thrived for 4 decades now. Do you have core values? How do you define behaviors that are rooted in your core values? How do you reward those behaviors? Can you talk to that?
yeah. So we do have critical values, and the word critical is capitalized, and it's an acronym. It stands for communication, respect, integrity, teamwork, innovation, communication, accountability, and learning.
I just put you on the spot. I didn't tell you I was going to ask you that. I speak at a lot of events where, business owners, CEOs, members of the companies are sitting there and say, who here has core values? Raise your hand. And pretty much everybody raised their hand. And then I asked somebody, okay, what are your core values? And they can't remember them. So kudos to you, not only remembering them, but there are 8 of them.
8 of them.
I mean, that's hard to do. But now the key is, okay, I call it, if you're not acting on your critical core behaviors, then I just call it wall art. It looks good on the office wall or on the website. How do you activate those core values into the workplace?
One, it starts at the top and it feeds down into the organization. And it is something that you could ask our top 50 people, and they can recite just what I recited, because we emphasize this just about every meeting. And I believe in getting feedback, not from my direct reports, but you go one level down. And then even deeper, when the company was 300 people, I'd walk around and talk to people, and I'd ask them questions. What works? What doesn't work? Because by the time we had 300 people, I was no longer answering phone calls from customers. I wasn't making collection calls on people who weren't paying their bills. So how the hell do I know what's best?
Right.
I could have a technology whiz, but he could be writing core programs that don't address the real problems.
Right. Yeah, I say to a lot of my CEO clients now that you're really empowered with 3 main things: casting the vision, driving the culture, and engaging in large business transactions. Like, we want to expand our plant. We want to move our offices. We want to, whatever, something that only the CEO can do, but casting that vision and driving that culture. And I think it might have been Toyota, but was it MBWA, management by walking around? Emotionally connecting with your people. And the only way you could do that is in quadrant 2 of the Eisenhower matrix, making sure you delegate those other things so you can do that. And a lot of people feel guilty. They don't feel like they're working when they're walking around checking on their people. There's we call it FOG, fear, obligation, guilt. The fear of, I'm not doing enough, or I have to, roll up my sleeves and sweep the floor too, or the guilt of, hey, I don't really have a tight schedule. I'm going to just walk around and see some people. Did you ever have to overcome the fog, the fear, obligation, guilt of moving into that CEO role and pushing down tasks to other people?
I really didn't, Matt. I don't want to sound arrogant.
No, it's not arrogant. It's not arrogant.
It's kind of just came naturally to ask people, how do you feel? If you ask me what are some of the real key components of success, I would tell you passion, because nothing great happens without passion.
That's right.
The other side of the coin of passion is compassion. caring for others, truly in your heart, caring about their well-being, and not just them at work, but their families, and asking questions about their wife, their children, not because, hey, that's a good thing to do,
Right.
because you really care.
Yeah, that's hard to fake, man. And if you try to fake it, you get sniffed out really quick. Wow, I could talk about culture all day long, and you know, it's obvious you walk the walk. Let's pivot to, you know, basketball term, pivot, right? To philanthropy, purpose, legacy. You give back. Where did that sense of responsibility come from?
Probably two places. One, and most importantly, from my mother, who taught me that if you have, you give. And so I think she deeply rooted that thought inside of me. And I think the other thing comes from growing up without much, you know, certainly in the earlier years. You recognize what people need. You see what people desire. And that led to my desire as a businessman, once we started lending, not to lend to the rich and the famous, but to lend to the underserved.
Wow.
And where most banks wouldn't lend, we decided that's where we would deploy our assets.
Wow.
And there's very little that I've done in my life that is more rewarding than what we've done as a company. We've probably lent to 10 million consumers over our 30 years of lending.
Wow, that's great. How do you encourage other business leaders to give back, especially the young CEOs that you're mentoring now?
You know, most of the young CEOs are not in the position where they can really deploy their own financial well-being into philanthropy, but I talk a lot about why it's so meaningful to me. And you know, I'm a graduate of University of Maryland. I donate a lot of money. I do not donate to the basketball program and the football program. I have named $1 million worth of scholarships in my mom's name.
Wow.
$1 million in my dad's name. And it's all to underprivileged, underserved community kids who can't afford college without the scholarships.
Yeah.
Just recently, we donated a significant amount of money to an essential needs program on the campus in College Park. What is essential needs? Matt, it blew my mind that 18% of the student body at the University of Maryland either can't afford food, doesn't have shelter, doesn't have clothing. Wow. It's a remarkable, I mean, I was astounded.
Wow.
And they just established this new essential needs program. And we were the first major donor. At Davidson College, where Bob and his son Matt now coach, we donated, again, a substantial amount of money for mental health. Athletes didn't have mental health care. My own son, who played soccer at a Division I school, Davidson, he told me if he had had this, he probably would have been a lot more successful as a student and as an athlete.
Wow.
So it comes from the heart.
Yeah, no, that's all. That is so powerful that you give back like that, and you do have that compassion. Let's finish up with a little bit of a lightning round here, and it just hit me because it was such an important part of our upbringing. What was your first pair of basketball or sneakers, we would call them? What was your first pair of sneakers?
High top white cons, canvas. All the kids wear them now, and they have no idea why.
Yeah, we all dreamed about the Adidas Pro model shell toe. And I remember Kevin Joyce walking into the park on a Saturday afternoon, and I think he was playing with the Kentucky Colonels at the time. And he came in wearing Chuck Taylors, carrying high top pro models. And he sat on that metal bench in the court number 1, but down in the far basket, and was taking off the Chuck Taylors and lacing up and I'm like, that is the coolest thing. So with my paper route money in 7th grade, I went to Athlete's Foot and bought a pair of Chuck Taylors and Adidas Pro models. I think that the total bill was about $40. Yeah. All right. How do you grow today? You know, you've reached the top. How does Don Berman, successful businessman, continue to get better?
I think if you, of our critical values, the last one is learning. And I am a voracious reader. And if you don't learn and grow, I can't even describe the feeling of how sad I am for you.
Right.
Because we don't know what the future holds. You have to constantly be learning. And when you think you're the smartest guy in the room, which I've never felt, I've never had the pleasure of that, but I know people who have, and they're dismissed.
Yep. What is the best business book? What book would you recommend to our audience?
I think the best book I've ever read is a book called The Hard Thing About the Hard Things. And it's by Ben Horowitz of Andreessen Horowitz, the venture capital company. And it is the hard things about the hard things. And it just talks about, as a leader, all the hard decisions that you have to make and the hard conversations. And it talks about why it's so hard. And you can embrace all of those things as a leader. Really good book.
Well,
and
go ahead.
The book I'm most looking forward to is I've had the real pleasure of becoming friendly with the head coach at the University of South Carolina women's team.
Dawn Staley.
And she just wrote a book called Uncommon Favor. And I just bought it. It just got released, and I can't wait to read it.
What advice would you give your 25-year-old self?
Prepare for a wonderful journey. Because at 25, I had no clue where I was going with my business, with my career. And as I've told many people, I could never, ever have dreamed of the journey and ultimately where I've ended up. My imagination wasn't that good.
All right, in the park, we walk in, games are going on. We say, who's got next, right? So next was a big term, big word in the park. What's next for Don Berman?
I think next for Don Berman, my love of sports has driven me to want to invest in mostly women's sports, but in basketball, women's basketball. My son, as I said, and my daughter were both very high-level soccer players. So investing in that sport, I think that, along with mentoring CEOs, not only startups, but people who are in the mid-journey. I just joined the board of a company called Roan, where the CEO is 43 years old, and the company it's an athleisure company. He's got some private equity investors. They're a private company. His family is well invested. And I wanted to join their board because I really think that my experiences can benefit him in his journey.
Is there a question that I should have asked you, Don, that I didn't?
I don't think so. I do want to tell you my two favorite my best experience at the park and my worst experience at the park.
Okay. Go ahead.
My best experience goes back to when I first moved to Long Island. Actually, I was a freshman in college, and my brother and I would go up and play one-on-one. My brother's 4 years older than me. The very first time I beat him one-on-one, he made me walk home. And man, that was a joy. I've never been that happy in my life. I went to get in the car and he locked the door. He wouldn't let me in.
I love it.
And I don't know if you remember this, but my worst experience, you said earlier, you played in the park, you called your own fouls. I was dumb enough to try to draw an offensive foul in the park on a guy by the name of Matt Doherty. You were, I think, going into your junior year at UNC, and you were standing over me. At that time, you were, what, 6'6", 6'5", maybe 6'7"?
Yeah, 6'7".
I'm on the ground. It was definitely an offensive foul, by the way, Matt. But I'm on the ground, and you're straddling me, and you're saying, "Are you fucking trying to kill me?" And I will never forget that, because I was like, "Guy's right."
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. You know, my wife can give me a hard time about remembering moments like that in the park 50 years ago and forgetting to bring home a half gallon of milk. but you're never going to replace those moments that are such a huge part of who we are. And I'm grateful to know you, Don. You know, I really am blessed to reconnect with you. And I want to thank you for joining us today and sharing your story on the Rebound. Thank you, Don.
Thank you very much, Matt. Appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you again.
Leadership is a learned behavior. We all lead in some way, shape, or form. We all deal with adversity. And when you do, I challenge you to rebound. I challenge you to learn and grow. If you'd like to contact me about executive coaching, workshops, or giving a keynote talk, you can reach me at dohertycoaching.com. That's DOHERTY coaching.com. Thanks for tuning in.